Yeah, maybe it is, yeah. You're right, it's 10:02. Okay, I'm going to apologize. Okay, I thought it was 10 o'clock, but it's 10:02. It's time for us to get started, people. We're in Mark chapter 2. If you're in the Pew Bible, which I'm teaching from, it's page 1226. Mark chapter 2, starting at verse 23. I want to do about a 1-minute review, and yes, Tom, you can time me on this one, about chapters 1 and 2. Chapter 1 of Mark introduces John the Baptist and Jesus. Jesus starts collecting disciples. He starts teaching. He starts taking his disciples with him around the area around Capernaum where he's living. He starts doing miracles. He starts attracting a crowd. That's kind of like chapter 1 right there. Chapter 2, which we're coming to the finish of now, is Jesus doing a number of miracles, but in chapter 2, we find that Jesus is now facing some reaction that is not happy. The Jewish religious leaders are listening to him and disagreeing with him. And, for example, in chapter 2, verse 6, why does this fellow talk like this? He's blaspheming, and so on. And then down a little bit further on verse 16, he's eating with Matthew and his fellow tax collectors and sinners, and they say, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? And you can tell that's not a friendly question, you know. And then a little bit further in verse 18, how is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not? Now here I want to stick in this. Okay, the minute's over, but I'm going to start teaching here. So, okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. In verse 18, when they ask the question, how is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not? That's also a question that's actually accusing him of doing something that they wouldn't do. And I mentioned this last week. They wouldn't eat with the sinners. They wouldn't do that. No, fasting. They would be fasting, and they thought Jesus' disciples should be fasting. But we didn't talk about that question. When I got to this question, why are your disciples not fasting? I said that fasting is not commanded by God in the Old Testament or New Testament. There are people that do fast in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, but it was never a command. But why are they saying, why are your disciples not fasting? Because the Jewish religious leaders, not this group in particular, but over centuries, had made a whole lot of rules about what you could and couldn't do. They had hundreds of rules about what you could and couldn't do on the Sabbath. They had hundreds of rules, not just about fasting, but exactly how you fasted, what you could eat, how you could eat it, including your hand motions. You had to eat it in a certain specific physical way. Now, someone tell me what the problem with that is. Yes. Now here they ask that question, why are yours not fasting? Jesus answers them, but not directly. Sometimes Jesus would refuse to answer a question. Sometimes he would answer it in a way that was trying to get more to the real problem there. And I got to thinking about my kids sometimes, because my kids, they come and ask me a question, and I knew that was not their real question. They would ask a question, ask another question. After 4 or 5 questions, they would finally get down to what they were really wanting to talk about. You ever had that happen to you? Well, I think that's kind of here sometimes with Jesus. But sometimes, as Tom just said, these Jewish religious leaders were not the right kind of people. They wanted to make rules that everybody had to obey. Their rules. Now, right here, he doesn't talk about that. But if you hop on down to Mark chapter 7, I'm not going to spend any time here because we'll talk about this later. In Mark chapter 7, verses 5 through 8, Jesus not only answers their question, but he answers it very strongly and very bluntly, and not to their happiness either. Okay. Mark chapter 7, verse 5. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I'm going to read through it. So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, "Why don't your disciples live according to the traditions of the elders instead of eating their food with defiled hands?" You see that question? They're saying, why aren't your disciples following the tradition of the elders? Now, when they say elders, what do they mean? They mean the Jewish religious leaders in the past, including them. And Jesus answers their question point blank and straight. Verse 6, Jesus replied, "Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites." Pretty blunt. When we get there, we'll talk about what hypocrites it means. As it is written in Isaiah, "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules." And Jesus is saying that the people that Isaiah was talking about way in the past, that these Jewish teachers here were doing the same thing. But notice there's one more verse here. Well, there's a bunch more, but we're just going to stop at verse 8. This is not out of Isaiah. This is Jesus himself making his conclusion to what he's just said to them. You, meaning the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human traditions, which is exactly what Tom said. And when he says this, is he complimenting them? No. And they know it. He's saying that they are doing wrong by doing that. Do we have legalists in religion today? Oh, yeah. Do we have legalists in non-religious activities in the world, in politics? Do we have people in politics to want to make rules on other people and they got to do them? And sometimes they can do that because in politics they can make laws. But does that mean that maybe they're great laws? Well, that's one reason why they have the amendment process, because when I worked for Social Security, this happened on and on and on. Congress would pass a law involving Social Security, and then about 3 or 4 months later, when people actually got to read the thing and realize what it said, oh no, we got to amend that, we got to change that, we made a mistake in that. They would add an amendment to another law and changed a whole bunch of the things that they had done in that law they had passed 3 months ago. This was not the unusual. This happens still today in Congress all the time. But at least they're changing what they realized was wrong. Okay, I'm not getting into politics. Not trying to do that. Okay, so what's the answer to that question? How is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not? Why were the disciples of Jesus not fasting? We don't know. You don't say it straight out because the text doesn't tell us. But by Jesus' answers and by things that Jesus said later, it could be that in the simple thing, they asked Jesus, do we have to fast? And he said, no. But probably they were listening to Jesus talk about how the disciples didn't have to follow these human rules that the Pharisees had been cooking up for centuries. And his disciples weren't fasting because, remember, there's no command by God to fast. There's no command to God as to how you fast, what you fast, how you move your hands when you're fasting. Those are all man-made, yeah.
I always thought because they knew that Jesus was the Son of God and believed in God, and people were fasting to communicate and grow closer to God and find His will. They didn't need to because they were already in the presence of God.
Could be, sure, that's possible. Sure. Good thought. Positive kind of thought. Tom? Go ahead. Right. Yeah. Sure. Right. Exactly. You took the words out of my mouth. That's great. No, that's great. You said it great. And the very first thing you said in your sentence, I know I can only walk so far on the Sabbath, okay? That's not in the Old Testament. There's nothing in the Old Testament about how far you can walk. Why did they say that? Because Jesus said, don't work on the Sabbath. Well, work is a general word. What does work mean? So they started making rules about work, this work, that work, that work. And so they came down to the rule about work of walking. None of that is in the Old Testament. It's all something they made up. And they kind of ended up with about 6/10 of our mile. 6/10 of a mile, that's as far as you could walk in a day. Yeah.
When Tom was talking about that, I thought, the Pharisees, when they were first established, probably weren't, it was good. They were kind of answering those things, and it became, through time, a bad thing. It's not like the Pharisees started out going, we're going to start doing all these laws and depending on people and stuff like it. It kind of evolved over time.
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
So a lot of the stuff that is good now, we have to be careful that we don't let it deteriorate and become something evil farther down the road.
If you do something twice, it becomes a habit. I said this one time, not here, but I said it another place, about guys shaving. I don't know about you guys, but every time I shave, I start in one spot and then I go here and then I go here and I go there. And I mentioned that one time and people came up to me and they said, yeah, that's exactly how I shave. Other people came and said, I never shave that way. But you see how if you get doing something one way, it's easy to say, well, I'm going to do it tomorrow that way. I'm going to do it tomorrow. And in 5 years from now, you're thinking you can't conceivably do it any other way. And that's just you yourself, Bill.
Well, and your kids pick up on those habits too.
Yeah.
The old cutting hand off the hand. Heard that one, right?
No, what is it?
Well, they every time somebody would cook a ham, they said,
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And so Grandma did it, and you ask Grandma, and she says,
pan was too small.
yeah, that's how wide the pan was. Yeah, so it becomes a rule for everybody. Yeah. And that's,
But kids will pick up on your habits and your thoughts too, and not even, I see it in my kids. I do some stuff like, Jeremy was telling me, I see some of my mannerisms and thoughts in him all the time. So I'm not sure if that's a curse on him or a curse on me.
one day I was driving down the road with my kids, and I said, well, we're going to go down the road this way. And one of my children sitting right over here said, Dad, do you know that's what Grandpa used to do when he said he was going to go down the road? It had never once occurred to me that I was imitating my father. All right, we've had our little talk about legalism. We're going to get into more legalism here in Mark chapter 2, verse 23. That's where we're going to start, okay? Because the Pharisees were full of it, folks. And as we see soon, they get so angry at Jesus that they decide they've got to kill him because he won't go by their rules. This is not just legalism, this is murder because you want people to follow man-made rules. Okay, that's jumping way ahead. Mark chapter 2, starting at verse 23. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, And as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. Why were they picking heads of grain? A little hungry. Maybe not very hungry, but... And this was a common thing that people would do back then. The Pharisee said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" It's unlawful on the Sabbath to pick grain. Is it? You don't have to turn over there unless you want to. Does the Old Testament talk about picking grain going down the road? Yes. In Deuteronomy 23, verse 25. When you enter your neighbor's standing grain, then you may pluck the heads with your hand, but you shall not wield a sickle in your neighbor's standing grain. You see what the command is? If you're hungry, you can take a little, but don't take a whole lot. Don't take it all. And by the way, the verse just before it says the same thing about if you're in your neighbor's vineyard, grapes. Verse 24, when you enter your neighbor's vineyard, then you may eat grapes until you are satisfied, but you shall not put any in your basket. Take a little bit, eat it, drink it, but don't rob your neighbor. Don't take it all. Okay? This thing that's discussed in Mark is talked about in the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament it says what Jesus' disciples were doing was correct. So why did the Pharisees think it was unlawful on the Sabbath? We've already answered that question. Because they had made rules off of the command in the Old Testament, don't work on the Sabbath. And they made those rules to where they would contradict Deuteronomy 23:25. But their rules overruled Deuteronomy 23:25. So when they said to Jesus here in verse 24, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? Jesus could have quoted to them Deuteronomy 23:24. But he didn't because he knew that, I think, because he knew that would just get into an argument about don't work on the Sabbath. So what does he say? What does he say instead? He answered, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat, and he also gave some to his companions. Now, how does that answer the question? They ask him, why are they doing what is unlawful? How does that answer that question? Not directly, obviously, but he tells a story out of the Old Testament, okay? Want to take a crack at that? How does his answer respond to what they're saying here? Yeah, that's what it says. So there was maybe an extenuating circumstance. There was a real need, because it says they were hungry and in need, okay? But to the Jews, you couldn't have exceptions to their rules. They wanted to force that rule. And Jesus then goes on to say, verse 27, then he said to them, these are the Pharisees, these are the ones that he's saying are doing wrong. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Let's talk about the first part of that. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Now think, folks, what does that mean? The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath.
Supposed to be a chance for man to rest and rejuvenate and recharge.
Yeah.
Stay away from work and not work yourself so much.
But it's also talking about this legalistic idea. You don't make a legalistic law that is contrary to the ordinary everyday needs that people have, which is exactly what they were doing. And then the second part, verse 28, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Who's the Son of Man? Jesus is the Son of Man. When Jesus says that I'm the Lord of the Sabbath, because he's the Son of Man, what's he saying? about the Sabbath. What's he saying here about this business about the Sabbath? Jesus can change the rules. They don't have to obey the rules of the Pharisees because the Pharisees had no right to make them and force them on people. But he's saying, I can change the rules. Well, we didn't have church here for what, 2-3 months? And then finally they said, well, you can get out. But Tom, help me remember this, or anybody. I don't think we got permission from anybody to have church. I think you guys just decided we're going to start having church. You guys didn't get permission from anybody to do that, did you? You said we're going to start having church, and then people started showing up for church, right? That's the way I remember it. Because in this country, we have freedom of religion, and they couldn't take that away from us, really.
It wasn't a law. There was no law passed.
Yeah.
It was a health recommendation.
But they wanted to enforce it.
That's different, but there's no
Yeah.
law to enforce.
And let's not get into COVID forever and ever, because a lot of people got real mad about COVID. But when they said that I couldn't leave my house, how do you think my dog felt about that? I have to walk my dog 4 times a day. I went ahead and walked my dog 4 times a day all the way through COVID. Why? Because I knew I was walking out on the street and there was nobody near me. That was using some judgment in a situation that wasn't going to work if the dog's in the house. And I decided I wasn't going to obey the rule, stay in your house. Okay, can we get off that? Yeah. Right.
And so, it's interesting that he's not giving them any more information because he knows they already know the answer.
Oh, yeah.
It was when he was on the run and he had no food and even what happened to the priest as a result of, I have to get this correct,
Right.
So it's just kind of interesting that it's like, you know the reason why this happened. This is similar.
Okay, I think we've answered this here. This has all been very good. I want to throw just one tiny extra thing in that maybe we won't spend any time on, but I'll just mention it to you. If you go back to 1 Samuel chapter 21, and don't run there right now, it doesn't read like exactly what it's saying right here. Now, I'm not saying Jesus is contradicting the Old Testament. What is it say in 1 Samuel 21? I'm going to give it to you real short and quick. David is running away from Saul, who is trying to kill him. That's the context. And he has a bunch of people that are running with him. They're hiding. And they go to Abiathar, this guy mentioned right here, and say, we're hungry. You got any bread around here? He doesn't ask for certain bread. He doesn't ask for that bread that was in the tabernacle. The tabernacle, the tent. Okay? He says, do you have any bread? It's the priest Abiathar that says, the only bread we have here is the consecrated bread. Abiathar offers David the consecrated bread for him and the people that he's with. Now, David got the bread, yeah, okay, and so Jesus is correct. He ate the bread. But it wasn't David's idea to do that. It was the priest's idea. And do you know there's no conversation in 1 Samuel 21 about how they were breaking the law? The high priest did not think that they were breaking the law by giving David that bread. He offered it to David. They took it. You don't see that unless you go back and read 1 Samuel 21. And just in passing, just a very tiny short, if you go on to read 1 Samuel 22, you find out what happens to Abiathar and his other priests because he did that kindness to David. Saul finds out. Saul's king. Kings can do anything they want. Saul finds out about Abiathar giving David some bread, and he has Abiathar killed, and I think it's 55, 65, 75 of the other priests killed. And then the city in which Abiathar lived, which is a little town called Nob, N-O-B, he sends his troops into the town and kills all the men, women, and children in the town. Consequences of doing something kind and good. And what happened with Saul? Saul killed them all. Only one descendant of Abiathar got away, and he runs to David, and David protects him. Again, we don't need to spend time on that, but it shows how that.
But Saul didn't kill him for religious reasons. Saul killed him because Abiathar kept David.
Yeah, Saul doesn't say they broke God's law. He says, I'm doing it because you helped David. Oh, yeah. Anybody that helps David is kill them. That's real clear in 1 Samuel 21 and 22. Okay, anyway, any comments on this thing down to the end of chapter 2? Well, we got 20 minutes. We're going to get started on chapter 3. No, we are not going to finish chapter 3 today, but we're going to take a crack at how far we can go. Any comments? Good. Verses 1 through 6. Everybody with me? Mark chapter 3, verse 1. Another time Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them, people in the synagogue, were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal them on the Sabbath. So what's the business with healing on the Sabbath? Does God command in the Old Testament that you can't heal a person on the Sabbath? No. This is another one of these rules that the Pharisees had dreamed up. Can't heal somebody on the Sabbath. Okay, we'll read on. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Oh, by the way, this event here is found in the other Gospels. In the other Gospel, it mentions that Jesus knew what these people were thinking. We've already run across this before in Mark, but it says Jesus knew that they were thinking in their heart. What's he going to do? He's going to heal that guy? We can accuse him if he does. Okay. Verse 4. Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?" There's a question. What's the answer to that question? What's the only possible good, true answer to that question? What is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? To do good. Okay? But they knew that if Jesus healed that guy, that they could say he was working on the Sabbath, which was not a rule from God, and then they could have a reason to punish him. So how do they answer the question? The verse says, verse 4, "What's lawful on the Sabbath? Do good or do evil, to save life or to kill?" But they remained silent. You guys answered that question easy and simple. They couldn't answer that question either way without contradicting what they wanted. So they just shut up. Verse 5, He, Jesus, looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. Is it a sin to be angry? No. It can be a sin with what you do when you get angry. Anger itself is not a sin. The Bible never says that. Jesus was angry at these people, distressed at their stubborn hearts. Stubborn heart. They couldn't say that it's good to do good because it's on the Sabbath. They couldn't say that.
They were very fine to let that guy stay with the withered hand.
Yeah, sure.
Rather than giving him healing.
That's what they would prefer. For the guy to stay the rest of his life with a hand he couldn't use. Okay, let's read on. He said to the man, this is verse 5, "Stretch out your hand." He, the man, stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. You notice Jesus didn't touch the guy? Apparently, well, the way this is written, it was like he had his hand underneath his cloak because he didn't like people to see his withered hand or something. Jesus said, pull your hand out. When the guy pulls his hand out, it's whole. A miracle was done. Who can do miracles? Think about that for a second. Who can do miracles? Or by what power can people do miracles? God can do miracles. Verse 6. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. This is the first time in the book of Mark, 3rd chapter, 5th, 6th verse, where the Pharisees are saying, this guy's got to go. And the event was Jesus healing a guy on the Sabbath. Isn't that amazing? It shows how the legalistic mind can be so, in the rut, that it can't think of any other thing, can't think of anything else other than the rut. Any comments on that section, verses 1 through 6? Yeah. Try to keep your rule. Yeah. And he gave him a chance. He asked him the question. What is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or do evil, to save life or skill? Either way they answered that question, they were condemning themselves. So they just kept their mouth shut. That's really bad when you can't have an obvious question with an obvious answer and you can't give the obvious answer to do good. But they couldn't do it. Intentionally, to try to get them to think about what is the right way to worship God, what is the right way to live. But they can't do anything against the rules, and they had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rules that they tried to push on people. Okay. Did he want to provoke the people to kill him? I'm not so sure, but he knew that he came to earth to die on the cross for our sins. He knew that. It was going to happen. If it wasn't going to be done by these people, it'd be done by the Romans or somebody else. But you're right. Jesus came to earth to die on the cross.
Well, and you also had to point out their error.
Yeah, they were wrong. Right. Defend it.
We don't want to admit it, we feel bad, so we do something maybe stupid. They're the same way.
Yeah, sure.
He proved them to be wrong and gave them a chance to repent, which some of them did, but as a whole they didn't.
And they had set themselves as the religious authorities. Now think about that. Don't work on the Sabbath. Well, that's a real vague thing. But see, we're the religious authorities. If we make a bunch of rules about what you can and can't do on the Sabbath, in effect, they're speaking for God. They're saying that they have the authority from God to do this kind of thing. They believed they had the authority from God. But they didn't have that authority. That's one reason why they hated him so much, because he rejected their authority to speak for God when God hadn't spoken about this. And in the case of Deuteronomy they read, God had spoken contrary to what their legalism said. So forget that command in the Old Testament, because we're speaking for God now. Okay, next section. Yeah, we got some time. Verses 7 through 12. Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the lake. That's apparently the Sea of Galilee. And a large crowd from Galilee followed. When they heard about all he was doing, many people came to him from Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, and the regions across the Jordan and around Tyre and Sidon. Now, we all know Judah was in the south of Israel. Jerusalem is a city. But what about this Idumea? Okay? Where's that? Well, that's south of Jerusalem. To put it simple, it's 80 miles south of the Sea of Galilee. That's how far away people were coming to hear Jesus. Just like people came a long distance to hear John the Baptist. People were coming a long distance now to hear Jesus. And the regions across the Jordan and around Tyre and Sidon. Where are Tyre and Sidon? They're on the Mediterranean Sea. They're about 60, 70 miles northwest of here. And who are these people in Tyre and Sidon? They're not Jews. There were some Jewish people that would live there, but apparently these are Gentiles that are coming to see Jesus. Now, in this text, it doesn't say people got mad about Gentiles coming and Jesus talking to them and working with them. But in other Gospels, oh yeah, Jesus gets a lot of criticism because people that were not Jews came and Jesus treated them fairly and kindly. No, you can't do that. You can't do that. Because we made a rule against it. Okay, verse 9. Because of the crowd, he told his disciples to have a small boat ready for him to keep the people from crowding him. Now, you know what that means. He gets in the boat, gets 20 feet off the shore, and so the people are on the shore, and they're not in a big crowd right there where he's at. He's got a little space there. Also makes it easier for people to hear him. Verse 10. For he had healed many, so that those with diseases were pushing forward to touch him. Whenever the impure spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, "You are the Son of God." But he gave them strict orders not to tell others about him. This is just a little paragraph of how Jesus is not just doing miracles or arguing with the Pharisees, but he's still out there seeing people. He's still moving around. He's still teaching. Any comments on any of this right here? Okay, we got 5 more minutes. Let's see what we can do. Verses 13 to 19. This is where Jesus picks the 12. Now in Mark, has he even met all the 12? No, it's not all there. In fact, some of these people, the Bible never tells us when he met them and how he met them. But here's where well, I'll just read it to you. Verse 13. Jesus went up on a mountainside and called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. It wasn't just anybody that walked up. Jesus handpicked these guys, these 12. He appointed 12 that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach. Verse 15. And have authority to drive out demons. Think about that for a minute. The authority to drive out demons means that these 12 can now do miracles. The miracles are done by the power of God. But Jesus had the ability and the authority to give them the ability to do a miracle with the power of God. Think about that for a second. These are the 12 he appointed. Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, James the son of Zebedee and his brother John. To them he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. That's the 12. There's 2 times in the Gospels that this is found, the listing, and it's the same 12. Here's where Jesus appoints the 12. And now, guess we're going to get to this in a minute. Well, maybe not today. But he takes the 12 out with him, and they go around teaching, and they can heal people. And then he sends them out without him to go and come back. We'll get into that later on. There's just one or two comments I thought I would make here. This business about James and John, and this is John who wrote the Gospel of John, remember, which means sons of thunder. Wonder why he calls them that. If you saw the show, The Chosen, there's a long section on that. Apparently these two guys are a little hot-headed sometimes. Sons of thunder. They had temper. We don't know, but that's the name he gave them. And then also there's a few others here. Simon the Zealot, Z-E-A-L-O-T. What's a zealot? Anybody know that one?
Jewish sect was very, very zealous for the cause, and they would actually, were kind of, from what I understand, they were actually assassins of people that were going against the Jewish faith.
Yes. There's a little bit more to that. The zealots wanted to kill the Romans. In our time today, we would call them terrorists. They were fighting the official government in the land. Yes, that was an occupied country. The Jews didn't want them there. But the zealots would kill Roman soldiers when they could get a hold of them. Jesus picked this guy, Simon the Zealot, who had committed himself to killing people. Now, had he done it? We don't know. We know almost nothing about this fellow later on. But he was one of the 12.
And he wasn't the one that stepped up in the garden.
I'm sorry? No. Yeah. Now, but think, outside of Judas, who betrayed him, what do these other 11 actually do with their lives? Matthew doesn't collect taxes anymore. The fishermen aren't fishing anymore. Simon isn't going around thinking to kill Roman soldiers anymore. What do they do with the rest of their lives? They go all over the Roman Empire preaching and teaching. Amazing. Of course, there's always the silly question, why did he pick Judas Iscariot? I'm going to give a thought on that. Maybe we can talk about this another time. There are times in the Gospels where Jesus talks to this Judas Iscariot who betrayed him, and he talks to him like, you can do good. He doesn't say those words. That's not what I'm trying to say. But he talks to him kindly. Maybe Jesus had hope that Judas could change and not be the thief. He was a thief. He stole money from the apostles and so on. He was a lover of money. Maybe he could overcome the love of money. Maybe he could become a better, different guy. I don't know. The Bible doesn't say. But for some reason, Jesus chose this fellow that had some real personality flaws, to say the least. Bill, you had your hand up. You change your mind?
Well, no, this is kind of a different subject, going back where it says the spirits said that you are the Son of God.
Where are you talking about?
Back up in verse 11, you know, the demons believe.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So I just saw this reel. I'm not saying it's a good reel or a bad reel, but it showed this guy entering hell, and he comes face to face with Satan, and Satan's going, "Oh, Mr. Smith, it's so good to have you here." And the guy's looking at him kind of weird. He goes, you know, and he talks to me. He goes, "Wait a minute, aren't you Satan?" He goes, "Yes." Why are you giving me so much respect? Because this guy was an atheist.
Oh, Smith was an atheist. I don't know that story. Go ahead.
And Satan says, "Because you committed the sin that I can't." And I thought, oh my goodness, what? That just struck me. I never thought of that.
And the sin was?
Not believing in God.
Yeah. We did talk about that just a little bit last week.
Yeah.
Blasphemy is speaking against God.
Yeah, I know. It's just interesting that I never even thought about the devil, the
Yeah.
worst being ever.
Where'd you hear that story from?
I just saw it on a reel on the internet.
Okay.
And it just struck me. I never thought of before that a person that's an atheist is committing a sin that the devil himself could not commit.
Yeah.
And that just kind of, I just kind of, oh.
Last week I had a word I wanted to say about what it means to blaspheme God, and the word I couldn't think of, I think Bill Dover told me later on, insult. If a person insults God, that's blasphemy. A person who's an atheist that says there is no God, that's blasphemy. You're insulting God. And for all that matter, so is an agnostic who says, I don't know, maybe he is, maybe not. Those people are insulting God. Okay, it's 15 till. It's time for us to stop. We will start next week with Mark chapter 3, verse 20. We got more than halfway through the 3rd chapter. We're making a little progress. Appreciate your comments and